Hello and welcome to this edition of Bayou Time. I'm your host, Keith Whiteside, licensed clinical social worker with Cherubim Home Care. Very glad you're joining us. However you may be joining us, we appreciate it very, very much. And as we look back 1 year to the anniversary of Hurricane Ida, I think all of us spend and want to spend a little time thinking about how it happened, what happened, and how we move forward. One of the best people to help us do that is State Representative Beryl Amedee, District 51 out of Gray. Beryl, thanks for joining us.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
All of us, as I kind of mentioned, are, you know, thinking about Ida. It's hard to believe that it's been a year, but for those of us who have been trying to watch some of the recovery, it's amazing that we've not gotten as far as we should in a year. Tell us a little bit about what your experience was for the storm and maybe some of the things that we've learned moving forward.
Sure. Well, it has been a year, and sometimes it seems like it's been many years for what
Right.
we've been through. And then in the next moment, you can remember it like it was yesterday.
Right.
So the memories are very vivid.
Right.
We're still actually living through it. We're still in the recovery phase.
Right.
Thank God we've made so much progress. But let's see. During Ida, we boarded up the house as we always do when it's going to be 3 or higher,
Right.
and we chose to stay home as we always do when it's maybe going to be a 4. But I'll have to say that halfway through that storm, with all of the damage we were seeing through our little spaces in the windows and all of the wind and the sounds we were hearing and what was happening in our neighborhood, we had second thoughts a couple of times.
Right.
We kind of looked at each other and said, maybe we should have
Yeah.
left.
Did we make the right decision? And again, I think that there are a lot of people that chose to stay that next time won't.
That's what I'm hearing. There are plenty of people that said, that was it, never again. I didn't
Right.
need to be here during the storm.
Right. And for me, it's just the opposite. My wife had just had surgery about 10 days before the surgery, 10 days before the storm. We had to leave. And I will tell you, I felt badly for my family here, my HTV family, felt badly for our community. And I felt terribly about the damage that was caused to my home. And I wasn't here to do anything about it. And
Yes.
so we had to completely redo our home, the entire house.
And there's no easy decision.
No.
Everybody has to weigh the risk to them, to their family, the potential risk to their home, and make that decision. It is a tough call,
It really
no matter
is.
which one you choose.
And so one of the things that's bothered me, I'm glad you brought it up because it's been aggravating me for a year. You've gotten some reports from some people down in Dularge and Dulac. There is no way that this was a hurricane category 4.
Yes, I firmly believe that sometime in the future, as they often do, when the weather scientists restudy the storm again, they're going to have to recategorize this. From what I've heard from the mariners who weathered the storm right off the coast down in my district, Dulac and Dularge, the sustained winds were much higher than what the weather experts are reporting. They're reporting that the sustained winds were 150, which is a category 4. But from what I'm hearing, one mariner said that his gauge didn't move off of 183 for over 5 hours. He thought it was broken until it finally moved. So that's a sustained wind of 183. That's definitely a 5. On the Saffir-Simpson scale, the category 5 begins at 157. So that was more than
Far
enough margin.
surpasses that.
Yes.
They did this, they measured the same thing down in LaRose. I've been told that they can't categorize anything on land, but these were mariners who were right there at
At the coast.
the coast.
They weren't out floating around in the Gulf.
No.
And then
no.
to look at the damage afterwards. I had been trained before being elected to the House as a disaster relief chaplain.
Right,
And so I was
specialist.
deployed on a couple of tornado outbreaks, the aftermath of some major tornadoes up in northern Alabama and Mississippi. And I have to tell you that the damage that I saw after these extremely strong tornadoes, some of them record-breaking for those areas, was just like the damage that I saw down the bayous. So in Terrebonne Parish, when you ride down the bayous and you saw destruction that looked like a bomb went off, and it wasn't a narrow path like it was caused by a tornado.
Right.
It was all over. It was broad, it was wide. those things tell me that something is amiss. This was not a Category 4. I've lived here all my life. I've seen the destruction after Category 3, after Category 4, and I am not a trained weather scientist, but just from my observation and experience, I'm saying it's a Category 5.
And you and I are having the same exact thought process, and it's almost demeaning or patronizing to be able to say, "Oh, it was just a 4," when
It
the
is.
damage really appears and looks like it's a 5.
That's right, because if we accept that it was only a 4, which is still a very strong storm, and then we see the magnitude of the damage, then that seems that maybe our houses weren't really built up to code. Maybe our weather protection devices weren't really as strong as they should have been. When the reality was the storm was stronger than they're telling us.
Yeah. And quite frankly, some of the really good things is that the test for Merganza to the Gulf, it could not have been tested on something stronger. And boy, did it hold
Yeah.
and really make a difference for us not seeing the mass and massive flooding like we did with all of the massive wind damage.
That's right.
So there's some silver linings, if you will, to the preparation. A lot of people were well prepared. A lot of people heeded the warnings. A lot of people listened to what they needed to do. And this was the most traumatic event to affect Terrebonne Parish in my 54 years, to my knowledge, to this date. One of the things that we spent time talking about, some of the challenges, we saw the support and we saw the love of neighbor better right after this storm than maybe at any other time. So after the most traumatic event that we could have possibly experienced, we saw people taking care of one another.
That's right. I don't know if the winds had finished blowing yet when the people in our community were already checking on neighbors, reaching out, sharing whatever was needed. And I have to say, I have to give a shout out to mainly the churches in the area who took it upon themselves to organize and to be the recipient of a lot of the outpouring of relief objects and dollars that came from all over the country. We had churches that for months, in fact, a few are still operating as relief centers in that they're housing volunteer workers and charitable organizations that have come to help people, especially those who did not have insurance coverage or who may not have qualified for certain programs like FEMA programs. And so the outpouring is actually still going on. It's just beautiful. It's a shame that sometimes it takes a disaster to get us all to pull together, but I thank God that when we have one, we do.
Yeah, disasters tend to do one of two things. Deaths do the same. They either pull people apart or draw them together. Fortunately, our community pulled together. Other people, law enforcement, just so very present, even with some of the issues that they experienced, losing a member of HPD to an accident, almost losing another. And so those kinds of things made it very, very challenging, and yet they were always so present. You mentioned churches and food and feeding people. The TCU churches, Terrebonne Churches United Food Bank, really, we hear some of the stories that Lawrence Dehart dealt with. They are out in the midst of the storm, making sure that they were protecting the food so that they could protect and feed others, and just remarkable kinds of things. And so we saw such a huge blessing there after the difficulty. My brother and I, just some 5 days after the storm, were working diligently to try and recover as much as we could with my house and my father's house, or my mother and father's house. And we couldn't get food anywhere else. We were fed by the churches.
Yes.
And so it's just one of those things that was remarkable.
And I have to say that the food bank with Mr. Dehart went above and beyond. I mean, thank God for the work they did during the storm and, like you said, protecting the food and the facility and all. But I have to say, for weeks and weeks, or a couple of months after the storm, as I went around, especially my district and sometimes through the remainder of the parish, to check with all of the relief sites.
Right.
Anytime any relief site had the manpower to distribute food, the food bank was willing to provide the food that could distribute.
Right.
And very often we connected those dots. And as I went around, I would check often with the fire departments in each community because they never stopped.
Nope.
And when you remember that the firefighters and law enforcement, these people are all our neighbors. They had homes that were damaged also.
Some
They
lost
had
everything.
some lost everything. Many of these, they sent their spouse and children away to evacuate while they stayed behind and spent their time at the firehouse
Right.
and
Living
helping
there.
the community while their own house was in need.
Right.
And so the sacrifice of the people that are our very neighbors right here in our own community was just impressive and touching.
Yeah. And starting with that starting point a year later, now moving forward to where we are now, there are still people communicating and calling you that are still have very broken system, broken homes, and housing issues, and living in houses that maybe they shouldn't be
Yes,
a
and
year later.
we have plenty of people who are now back in their homes. We also have plenty of people who are in temporary housing, and thank God that they're
Right.
not living in something
In a
that's
car.
falling apart,
Right.
or in a car, yes. But every week, I get a few phone calls or emails from people in our community who are somehow stuck. Either their FEMA claim has not been completely handled yet, or there's been a miscommunication, or their insurance company has gone under, or the mortgage company is holding on to the insurance check, and so even though they may have a contractor lined up, they can't get started. I mean, there are just a number of problems that are roadblocks to people. And so I'm glad that it seems that people in the community are just being a little more kind right now to others, because you never know if the person next to you in line at the grocery store is coming from their own home, which is perfectly fine and functioning, or whether they're still facing housing issues. They may still be going home to a house that every time it rains, it leaks in one room or three rooms. They might still be living in a house that's partly covered by a tarp. And so it takes a whole lot of patience and a little bit of compassion to just function in the community and just be kind. And I see people doing that.
And it takes a whole lot of support. And I will tell you, you and all of the representatives, all of the elected officials have been fighting tooth and nail to get people what they need. And what I'd like to do is take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit about some accountability for some people that maybe have taken advantage of others, as well as some of the positives, some more positives that have come from this storm, really raising the awareness for other people to say, listen, this is what really happened. This is what we need to do. And some laws that have kind of changed, some things that we'll be able to put into policy that will make things a little bit easier in the future.
Yes.
Not for the next storm, because I don't want that, but in
Right.
the future. Things that you can provide to us that not a lot of people can is some of the updates on what we've been able to kind of get past with all of the trauma and destruction that we experienced.
Oh, sure. As I've done town halls, giving after session reports, there's a whole segment of bills that I cover that were directly inspired by what we experienced through the storms. Not only Ida, but the ones that hit in West Louisiana
Right.
too, a year before. So many of the things that we experienced here were also experienced there. So we had a lot of bills ready to go for
Right.
this session. Some of the things, that, if you remember, fuel was very difficult to come by.
Right.
Now, there are always going to be delays, especially when the roads are not passable yet. So some delay is expected, but
Right.
we found that there are certain laws we had in place that might have increased our misery. So we brought bills this year to change those laws so that during a disaster, during the recovery, certain laws will be suspended. And those involve restrictions on selling and transporting fuel across certain jurisdictional lines. And also, we passed a law that bars local governments from limiting consumer access to certain fuel choices or specific types of fuel. I don't know that that went on here in Terrebonne, but
Definitely
it went on
did.
somewhere. They
Right.
wouldn't have had to bring a bill.
Right. Gotcha.
Something else we saw was horrible stories, horrible headlines about the fate of certain nursing home residents that had been evacuated badly. And so we passed bills this year to beef up the requirements on nursing homes. So they will now be required to have an emergency preparedness plan before they get a license, and then that plan has to be approved every year when they want to renew their license. And part of that plan is going to require that the state fire marshal inspects and approves evacuation sites that they choose before the Department of Health can issue an approval.
Wow.
So hopefully we'll never see those horrible headlines again.
Traumatic.
And of course, there's a lot of cleanup going on. So if you remember a year ago, we had money coming in from the federal government under the American Rescue Plan,
Right.
or ARP. Well, we spent a portion of that in last year's budget and then the rest of it in this year's budget. And I just wanted to mention that we set aside $5 million and gave that specifically to Wildlife and Fisheries to help them in the cleanup of the debris and boats that are stuck in the waterways.
Sure.
So the biggest number of bills that were hurricane inspired had to do with insurance. I'm sure you're not surprised.
Not shocked at all.
No. So
Which is good.
There were several. I'll mention a few here.
Okay.
We passed one bill that offers grant incentives to encourage new insurance companies to come and do business here in Louisiana.
Right.
We passed another one that establishes standards for communication and status updates between a residential policyholder and their insurance provider
Oh, good.
after a named storm or a hurricane. We passed another one that establishes deposit and disbursement procedures for property insurance settlements on a mortgaged home. So
Okay.
your mortgage company should not be able to hold you up any
Right.
longer.
And delay you.
Yes, and my favorite one is probably this one, although it's not a law, it's a resolution.
Okay.
We passed a resolution memorializing Congress to review and reform the National Flood Insurance Program's new pricing methodology. You remember Risk Rating
Oh, I
2.0?
do. Yes.
We sure hope they take us up on that.
Yes.
And also, we already had certain laws in place that were obviously broken by some unscrupulous people. And so there are a few dozen cases right now that are just beginning to make their way into the courts because, as you remember, the courts were closed for a long time because of COVID and then, of course, for hurricane damage. So these cases had to do with contractor fraud and sometimes fraud concerning the contributions being received and distributed at all of the relief sites.
Oh.
Yes, we had people who
Okay. I did not
unfortunately
know
had to
that.
be arrested for mishandling
Wow.
and abusing those contributions. And so I'm hoping that people take some comfort in knowing that law enforcement is on the ball and that those people who had been arrested for all these various things are going to have their day in court. It's still pending, but the process has begun to move, and we'll see what happens.
And we'll have a lot more on that. Our district attorney is going to be able to address some of those things, and really looking forward to getting some of those updates as they share with us. Because if ever there's a need, there's recovery that's needed, and there's accountability for those things or for those people who have taken advantage of others. It was one of those things where we've seen there was even in gated communities there were thefts of materials. We had several things stolen on our street, on my house, trying to get the recovery. And we got some of these very honest contractors who are trying to do the right thing, and we have others who are trying to steal stuff.
Yes.
So
And
in
we-
our
We do have to remember that there are good and bad in every industry, of course.
right.
And I have to say that not every contractor that comes from out of state is here to do harm.
Right.
And
There are some that are here to do good.
right. So just because they're from out of state doesn't mean that they can't be trusted. But I do have to say that there are people that come from out of state that know after disaster we're in a desperate situation, and we may not check references. We may not do our due diligence. And there are some that come take advantage of that.
Yeah, and we need to be careful of that. Some wonderful information, Beryl, these last few segments. I appreciate it very, very much. Thanks for your dedication to being able to come on and share with us some of these updates and what it is that we've learned here in this last year. And so that's a good thing. And so we have some really good things moving forward. So thank you for your time, as always.
Thanks for the invite.
All right, very good. And that will do it for this particular segment of Bayou Time. Don't go anywhere. A whole lot more local programming here on HTV.